The road to Blackwood hasn't changed in 20 years. Or maybe it's just that time doesn't work the same way here. My name is Elias. I left the neon lights of Portland, the crowded streets and the constant noise, just to return to this suffocating silence of the Oregon pines. The tires of my old pickup truck crunched over the dry needles and fallen branches. Each snap sounded like a bone breaking in the quiet of the morning. I was here for one reason: my grandfather's estate. Edward Elias was a man of shadows and secrets, and he had died exactly how he lived, alone in a house that seemed to be shrinking into the earth. As the cabin came into view, my heart felt heavy, like lead in my chest. The wood was gray, a dead, sickly gray, and the vines clung to the porch like skeletal fingers. I stepped out of the truck. The air was cold. It bit at my skin, smelling of damp soil and something I couldn't quite name. Metal? Old copper? I pushed the front door open. It didn't creak. It groaned, as if complaining about being disturbed. Inside, the dust danced in the beam of my flashlight, millions of tiny particles swirling in the stagnant air. Everything was exactly where he left it: the half-empty whiskey glass, the pile of old newspapers, and those marks, those strange, jagged symbols carved into the door frames. Grandpa wasn't trying to decorate. He was trying to keep something out. I walked toward his study, my boots heavy on the floorboards. There it was, the ham radio, a massive iron beast from the 60s. And next to it, the journal, signals from the other side. I touched the leather cover. It felt warm, unnaturally warm. I opened the last page, and my blood turned to ice. The entry said, "They are using Sarah's voice, but don't be fooled. Sarah never left the woods." Then it happened. The radio dial flickered. A dull orange glow filled the dark room. Shh. The static was thick, loud, but I hadn't plugged it in. The power cord was lying right there on the floor, coiled like a dead snake. And then, through the noise, came a whisper, a voice I would know anywhere.
"Elias, is that you? It's so dark in here, big brother."
The silence that followed Sarah's voice was heavier than the noise. My breath hitched in my throat, forming a cold mist in the unheated room. I stared at the radio, my hands trembling so hard I had to grip the edge of the mahogany desk. The orange glow of the dial seemed to pulse, like a dying heartbeat. I had to get out. I had to breathe. I grabbed the heavy brass flashlight and my grandfather's rusted hunting knife, then headed for the back door. As I stepped onto the porch, the wood groaned under my boots, a long, slow creak that echoed into the tree line. The backyard didn't look like a yard anymore. It looked like a graveyard of fallen pines. The fog had grown thicker, swirling around the trunks of the trees like white serpents. I remembered what the townspeople used to say about Blackwood. "Don't go where the moss grows thickest," they warned, "for the trees there have ears, and the shadows have teeth." I looked down at the base of a massive Douglas fir near the gate. The moss wasn't green, it was a dark, bruised purple, and it felt warm under my touch. A sudden snap broke the silence. Crack! It came from the direction of the old well, deep within the shadows of the pines. I swung my flashlight beam toward the sound. 2 eyes reflected the light, but they weren't animal eyes. They were too high up, 5, maybe 6 feet off the ground. They didn't blink. They just watched me from the edge of the darkness. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. No answer. Only the wind whistling through the needles, sounding like 1,000 people whispering at once. I took a step forward, and the eyes vanished. In their place, I found something stuck to the bark of the tree, a piece of blue fabric, torn, faded by 30 years of rain and sun. It was a ribbon, Sarah's hair ribbon. I held it in my hand, and for a moment, the forest went dead silent. No wind, no insects, just the sound of my own thumping heart. And then, from right behind my ear, a cold breath tickled my skin.
You shouldn't have come back, Elias.
I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the fog like a jagged blade, but there was no one there. Only the oppressive, suffocating wall of trees. The breath on my neck had felt so real, so cold, like ice pressed against my jugular. I scrambled back toward the porch, my boots slipping on the purple moss. I didn't care about the ribbon anymore. I didn't care about the secrets. I just wanted the safety of 4 walls and a locked door. But when I reached the back door, I stopped. My hand froze on the rusted knob. The symbols, the jagged marks Grandpa had carved into the wood, they weren't just carvings anymore. They were bleeding. A thick black substance, not quite blood, but darker, like liquid tar, was oozing from the cracks, dripping slowly onto the porch boards. Drip, drip, drip. I threw the door open and slammed it behind me, throwing every bolt, sliding every latch. I leaned my back against the wood, gasping for air, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The house was quiet, too quiet. Even the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway had stopped. I looked down at the floorboards. The dust I had seen earlier, it had moved. Small, barefoot footprints, the size of a child's, led from the kitchen directly toward the basement door. "Sarah?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. A soft, rhythmic thumping started from beneath my feet. Thump, thump, thump. Someone was in the cellar, and they weren't trying to get out. They were trying to call me down. I walked toward the cellar door, each step feeling like I was moving through waist-deep water. I grabbed the handle. It was freezing, painful to the touch. And then the radio in the other room roared to life, not with a whisper this time, but with a scream of pure white noise.
Don't open it, Elias. Don't look at the smiling ones.
The warning from the radio echoed in the hallway, then died into a low, menacing hum. The smiling ones. The name felt like a physical weight on my chest, cold and suffocating. My hand was still locked on the cellar door handle. The metal was so cold it felt like it was fused to my skin. I should have turned back. I should have run out of that house and never looked behind me. But the footprints, Sarah's footprints, they were still there in the dust, leading into the dark. I pulled the door open. The air that rose from the basement didn't smell like a normal cellar. It didn't smell of damp earth or mold. It smelled like pine needles and something ancient, like a tomb that hadn't been opened in 1,000 years. I began to descend the wooden stairs. 1, 2, 3. Each step gave a sharp, high-pitched protest, a crack that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. My flashlight beam cut a path through the dark, hitting the far wall. The walls weren't stone, they weren't wood. They were covered in photographs, thousands of them, all pinned to the dirt with long iron nails. I leaned closer, my heart stopping in my throat. They were photos of me. Me as a child, me at the grocery store last week, me sleeping in my apartment in Portland. But in every photo, someone was standing behind me, a tall, thin figure with skin the color of ash, and they were smiling. Not a human smile, but a jagged, impossible tear across their face, filled with too many teeth. Suddenly, the cellar door above me slammed shut. Bang! The latch clicked. I was trapped in the dark, with the smell of pine and the sound of dry paper rustling. I swung the flashlight around frantically. The photos on the walls, they were moving. The figures in the pictures were turning their heads, their wide, empty eyes following my light. Then, from the corner of the basement, where the shadows were deepest, I heard it. A soft, wet sound, like someone tearing a piece of raw meat.
"You found our gallery, Elias,"
a voice whispered, a voice that sounded like a chorus of 100 people speaking at once.
"Would you like to stay for the final portrait?"
My flashlight beam flickered, the battery struggling against a cold that felt unnatural. The wet, tearing sound grew louder, coming from every corner of the cellar at once. I backed away, my heel hitting a stack of old crates. My breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. "Stay back!" I screamed, swinging the rusted hunting knife into the empty air. But the air wasn't empty. Tall, spindly limbs, gray as wood ash, began to unfold from the darkness. They didn't move like animals. They moved like stop-motion film, their joints snapping and popping with every agonizing step. The smiling ones. Their faces were smooth like polished bone, except for that horrific mouth. A canyon of needle-like teeth stretched so wide it cracked the skin around their jaw. One of them drifted into the light. It was wearing a tattered flannel shirt. My grandfather's shirt. The realization hit me harder than any blow. These weren't just monsters. They were trophies. They were what remained of the people who stayed too long in Blackwood. I didn't think. I just acted. I grabbed a heavy jar of preserves from a nearby shelf and hurled it at the nearest figure. The glass shattered against its face, but it didn't flinch. It didn't bleed red. A thick black sap oozed from the wound, smelling of ancient pine and rot. It tilted its head, the grin widening. Then the ceiling above me groaned. The radio in the kitchen was still screaming, but the sound was changing. It wasn't static anymore. It was a rhythmic tapping. Tap, 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 tap. Morse code, Grandpa's old emergency signal. Behind the furnace, the roots. Follow the roots. I lunged toward the massive iron furnace at the back of the room. Behind it, the dirt wall had been breached by a massive pulsing tree root, thick as a man's torso. The dirt around it was loose, revealing a narrow, dark tunnel leading deep into the ground. The smiling ones hissed, a sound like steam escaping a pipe. They lunged. I dove into the dirt, the cold soil filling my mouth as I crawled for my life.
Run all you want, Elias. The forest has already tasted your fear. Your part.
The tunnel was a throat. That's the only way I can describe it. The walls weren't made of stone or simple dirt, but of a tightly woven network of roots that felt like cold, damp muscle. I crawled on my stomach, my flashlight held between my teeth, the beam shaking as I gasped for air that tasted of iron and ancient sap. Above me, I could hear the muffled thumping of the smiling ones pacing the cellar floor, their long claws scratching at the earth, trying to find a way in. As I pushed deeper, the tunnel began to widen into a cavern that shouldn't have existed beneath a simple farmhouse. The roots here were glowing, a faint, sickly bioluminescence that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light. Pulse, pulse, pulse. It looked like the forest had its own nervous system, its own veins, and I was crawling through its arteries. I saw things embedded in the walls, artifacts of lives stolen by Blackwood, a rusted bicycle from the 50s, a woman's high-heeled shoe, a silver locket still attached to a fragment of what looked like a petrified collarbone. The forest didn't just kill, it preserved. It collected memories like a child collects dead butterflies. Then the tunnel opened up into a central chamber. In the middle of the room stood a stone altar, cracked and weathered, surrounded by circles of white salt and black ash. And sitting on that altar was my grandfather's tin box, the one he mentioned in the journal. But it wasn't empty. It was vibrating. A low-frequency hum was coming from inside it, a sound that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. I reached out to touch it, but a voice stopped me. It wasn't Sarah's voice. It wasn't the smiling one's. It was my own voice, coming from the shadows behind the altar. If you open that box, Elias, the deal is broken, and the forest never loses a deal. I swung my light toward the shadow. There I was, or something that looked like me. It was sitting on a throne of roots, its eyes replaced by two glowing embers of amber. The thing on the throne, the thing that wore my face, didn't move. It just watched me with those glowing amber pits, a cold, mocking smile playing on its lips. What deal? I spat, my voice echoing through the hollow chamber of roots. What did my grandfather do? The double tilted its head, the sound of its neck snapping like a dry twig. He didn't want you to die, Elias. He wanted the line to continue, but the forest demands a guardian or a sacrifice. The hum from the tin box grew deafening, vibrating in the marrow of my bones. I looked at the box, then at the monster that looked like me. I'm not a guardian, and I'm definitely not your sacrifice. I lunged for the box. The double shrieked, a sound that wasn't a voice at all, but the roar of 1,000 falling trees. I grabbed the cold metal, the vibration stinging my palms, and I flipped the latch. Blinding white light erupted from the box. It wasn't a weapon, it was a release. The cavern began to shake, the bioluminescent roots turned a violent bloody red, and the earth itself seemed to groan in agony. I didn't wait to see what was inside. I shoved the box into my bag and scrambled up a vertical shaft of roots, climbing like a madman toward a sliver of moonlight above. I burst through the soil, gasping, coughing up the taste of ancient dust. I was outside, but I wasn't at the cabin anymore. I was in the heart of the whispering pines, miles from the road. The cabin behind me was nothing but a silhouette, its windows glowing with that same sickly orange light. I looked at my hand. The hair ribbon, Sarah's ribbon, was still tied around my wrist. And then, from every direction in the darkness, the sirens began. The low, rhythmatic wail of the dinner bell I had heard in the distance. I am Elias. I am alone in a forest that wants my soul, and the hunt has just begun. I stood there, gasping for air, clutching the tin box against my chest like it was the only thing keeping my soul from shattering. The cabin was gone. Not just behind me, but simply gone. It was as if the forest had folded space, swallowing the house and spitting me out miles into the wilderness. I remembered my grandfather's third rule, written in shaky handwriting on the back of a grocery receipt. If the stars are green, the forest is hungry. I looked up through the skeletal branches of the pines. The sky wasn't the deep black of an Oregon night. It was a bruised, sickly emerald, pulsing with a light that didn't come from any sun or moon. It was the color of rot, the color of ancient sap. Every tree around me looked identical, perfectly straight, perfectly silent, like pillars in a cathedral built for a god that died a long time ago. I tried to find my tracks, but the ground was covered in a fresh layer of pine needles, thousands of them, looking like sharp brown needles of bone. I took a step, and the needles didn't crunch. They hissed. Then, the whispers started. Not from the radio this time, but from the wood itself. The bark of the trees was rubbing together in the wind, but the sound wasn't random. It was mimicking human speech, raspy, dry, and hollow. Left. Go left, Elias. The path is open. Sarah is waiting at the end of the left path. I shook my head, closing my eyes tight. It's not her, I whispered to myself. It's just the wind. But the wind knew my name. And in Blackwood, the wind never tells the truth. I chose to walk straight, ignoring the invitations from the trees. My boots sank into the soil, which felt unnaturally soft, like walking on wet velvet. The further I walked, the stranger the forest became. The trees here were stripped of their bark, leaving them white and naked like bleached bone. I reached a clearing where the air was thick with the smell of old copper and dried flowers. In the center stood a totem, a jagged structure made of deer antlers and rusted barbed wire, reaching 6 feet into the emerald sky. And then I saw them, hanging from the wire like ornaments on a Christmas tree. Tongues. Dozens of them, dried, gray, and pinned to the wood with long iron nails. As the wind blew, the tongues didn't just sway, they vibrated. Each one was producing a different sound, a moan, a laugh, a sob, a scream. This was the forest's library. It didn't just steal your life, it took your ability to tell your story. It harvested your voice to lure the next victim. I saw a small, fresh tongue at the very top. It was still pink, still wet. I realized then that the Sarah I had heard on the radio wasn't a ghost. It was a recording played back by this organic machine of wood and meat. I fell to my knees, the horror finally breaking through my defenses. I wasn't in a forest. I was inside a stomach. And then a heavy hand, gloved and cold, dropped onto my shoulder. I nearly jumped out of my skin as that cold, gloved hand clamped down on my shoulder. I spun around, swinging my flashlight like a club, but the figure didn't flinch. Standing before me was a man in a tattered ranger's uniform. The fabric was a faded olive green, the kind they haven't issued since the mid-70s. He wore a heavy, rusted gas mask that obscured his entire face. The glass lenses reflected my flashlight beam, making him look like a giant insect staring back at me in the dark. "Don't make a sound," he whispered. His voice didn't sound like it came from a human throat. It was a mechanical wheeze, distorted by the filters of his mask, sounding like dry leaves being crushed under a heavy boot. He didn't look at me. He looked at the shadows behind me, shadows that seemed to be stretching and thinning, reaching out toward the light. Are you real?" I managed to stammer, my teeth chattering from the sudden drop in temperature. The ranger didn't answer. Instead, he reached into a pouch on his belt and pulled out an old flare gun. He aimed it straight up into the emerald sky. Thump! The flare ignited, bathing the entire clearing in a violent, flickering crimson light. And that's when I saw him. Not just one or two, but hundreds. The smiling ones were clinging to the white, barkless trees like leeches, their long gray limbs wrapped around the trunks, their jagged mouths open in a silent, expectant scream. The ranger leaned closer, the smell of ozone and old rubber coming from his mask. "They aren't here for you, Elias," he hissed. "They are here for what's in the box. The forest hasn't had a new heartbeat in 30 years, and it's starving." He shoved a heavy iron key into my hand. It was freezing, etched with the same bleeding symbols I had seen on my grandfather's door. "If you want to see the sun again, you have to reach the split cedar. But remember, the mother doesn't like intruders in her nursery." The ranger disappeared into the fog as quickly as he had arrived, leaving me alone with the iron key in the box that wouldn't stop vibrating. I ran. I didn't follow the paths. I ran through the thorns and the purple moss, my heart feeling like it was about to burst through my ribs. The forest was changing around me again. The ground began to heave and pulse, the tree roots rising and falling like the giant sleeping beast. Then I saw it, the split cedar. It was a colossus, a tree so massive it made the others look like toothpicks. It had been struck by lightning long ago, split down the middle, revealing a hollow core that glowed with a sickening orange light. But as I got closer, the wood inside the crack began to move. It unfolded. It wasn't a tree. It was the mother. She rose from the center of the cedar, a nightmare of knotted roots and human-like limbs, her skin a patchwork of stolen faces and dried pine bark. She had no eyes, but I felt her gaze burning into my very soul. "Elias," she groaned. The sound was a horrific symphony, 1,000 voices I recognized from the totem of tongues, all screaming my name at once. "Give it back," she commanded. A root, sharp as a spear, lashed out, narrowly missing my head and embedding itself into a tree behind me with the force of a wrecking ball. I looked at the tin box. The vibration was so intense now that blood began to leak from my ears. "My grandfather didn't give you this box to protect the forest," I shouted, my voice trembling with a mixture of terror and rage. "He gave it to you to keep you trapped." I jammed the ranger's iron key into the lock on the box. The mother let out a shriek that tore the emerald sky apart. The smiling ones began to drop from the trees like dead fruit, twitching and hissing as the air itself began to burn. I turned the key. Click. The moment the key turned, the world didn't just go silent. It died. The screaming of the mother, the hissing of the smiling ones, even the sound of my own frantic breathing, it all vanished into a vacuum of absolute, terrifying stillness. I stared at the lid of the tin box. It began to glow, not with the sickly orange of the forest, but with a pure, blinding white light that seemed to eat the shadows around me. Slowly, agonizingly, the lid creaked open. Inside, there was no heart. There was no gold. There was a single crystal vial filled with a liquid that looked like captured moonlight, and beneath it, a photograph. I picked it up with trembling fingers. It was a picture of my grandfather, Edward, standing exactly where I was standing now, 60 years ago. But he wasn't alone. He was holding the hand of a woman whose face had been scratched out with a knife, and behind them stood the mother, but she was small then, no taller than a sapling. The note on the back of the photo read, "The forest doesn't want our blood, Elias. It wants our grief. The more we mourn, the more it grows." The realization hit me like a physical blow. The mother wasn't an ancient demon. She was a manifestation of my family's sorrow, fed by decades of loss and the disappearance of Sarah. Suddenly, the ground beneath the split cedar erupted. Massive roots, thick as cathedral pillars, lashed out in a blind rage. The mother let out a sound that tore through my mind, a combination of a woman's sob and the grinding of tectonic plates. She wasn't trying to kill me anymore. She was trying to merge with me. "Stay with us," the voices whispered from her bark-covered throat. "Become the memory that never fades." I looked at the vial of moonlight, the truth, as my grandfather called it. I didn't drink it. I didn't hide it. I smashed it against the trunk of the mother. The liquid splashed against her wooden flesh, and wherever it touched, the wood began to turn to glass, transparent, fragile, and beautiful. The infection of grief was being frozen in time. The forest began to shatter, crystalline shards falling like rain from the emerald sky. I felt a hand on my shoulder, a real hand this time, warm, soft. "Run, Elias, before the glass breaks. Run and don't look back."
I didn't turn around to see if it was really Sarah standing there in the crystal ruins of the forest. I couldn't risk it. In Blackwood, hope is often just another lure, a brightly colored bait used to keep the prey from running too far. I ran. Every step felt like my legs were made of lead, my lungs burning with the taste of ozone and shattered glass. Behind me, the sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard. The musical, haunting tinkle of 1,000,000 glass shards falling to the earth as the mother's kingdom collapsed under its own weight. I burst through a final thicket of dead white brambles and stumbled, face first, onto the cold, hard asphalt of Highway 26. The transition was so sudden it made my head spin. One moment I was in a dimension of glowing roots and ancient grief. The next, I was back in the world of man-made things. The silence here was different. It wasn't the heavy, watchful silence of the pines. It was the empty, hollow silence of a world that didn't care I was alive. I lay there for a long time, my cheek pressed against the rough road surface, smelling the scent of old oil and rain. I watched the first gray light of dawn begin to bleed over the horizon, turning the sky from a bruised purple to a sickly pale yellow. I dragged myself up to a sitting position and looked back at the tree line. It looked ordinary, just a wall of dark Douglas firs and hemlocks swaying slightly in the morning breeze. There was no glass, no glowing amber eyes, no mother. I whispered, my voice sounding like sandpaper. It's over. It was just a nightmare. But then I felt the weight of the tin box in my bag, and I looked at my hands. They were stained with that thick black sap, a mark that wouldn't wash away no matter how hard I rubbed. I pulled my phone from my pocket. The screen was spiderwebbed with cracks, but it flickered to life. Zero signal, no service bars, but a notification icon was blinking. A voice message received at 3:33 a.m., the exact time I opened the box. I pressed play. At first, there was only the sound of heavy, rhythmic breathing. Then a voice spoke, my own voice. Elias, if you're listening to this, you've already made the choice. You think you've escaped the forest, but look at your shadow, Elias. Look at the road under the dawn light. I froze. I slowly turned my head to look at my shadow stretching across the highway. The sun was behind me now. My shadow was long, distorted, but it wasn't moving. Even as I waved my hand, even as I tilted my head, the shadow remained perfectly still, standing tall, arms at its sides. And even in the silhouette on the asphalt, I could see it, the jagged, impossible tear of a smile across its face. The sound of a heavy engine broke the trance. Two blindingly bright headlights appeared from the fog further down the highway. A black SUV, completely unmarked, pulled to a slow, methodical stop just 10 feet from me. The doors opened in perfect synchronization. 3 men stepped out. They weren't wearing police uniforms. They wore tactical gear with no insignia, and their helmets were etched with the same bleeding symbols I'd found in my grandfather's study. The man in the center stepped forward. He didn't pull a weapon. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small blue silk ribbon. "Mr. Elias," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, "the program is very impressed." He held out the ribbon. "It's time to go home. Sarah is waiting for the next signal." I looked into the dark tint of the SUV's window and saw a pair of amber eyes glowing from the back seat. I realized then I hadn't escaped Blackwood. I had just expanded its borders. Episode 1 was only the beginning of the end.